Welcome to the 9th lecture in the Henry VII series. Today we will examine the question, how important was late medieval England on the European stage? This will provide background context to a discussion of the foreign policy events in Henry's reign. This lecture will be split into 4 parts. The first section will compare the political geography of late 15th century Europe to modern day. The second section will examine a model that shows England's relative wealth and influence compared to her counterparts on the European stage. The next section will look at who the key players were in Europe during Henry's reign. Finally, we will examine Henry's key foreign policy aims, based upon what we know about England's position within Europe and Henry's own precarious position when he seized the throne in 1485. Let's first look at the geography of Europe in a little more detail. As you can see, many countries as we now recognize them are broken up into smaller states. The most notable of these is Germany in the center of Europe, but it is also worth noting that Italy was also comprised of smaller duchies or states. Spain and Portugal have the same borders as they do today, but Spain had only been recently unified. France has more land to the south in the Pyrenees to modern day. In 1485, they do not own the northwestern region of Brittany, but this will soon change. If you then look to Northern Europe, you will see that the countries of Belgium, Luxembourg and the Netherlands does not yet exist as countries in their own right, but rather form the larger Holy Roman Empire. We will look at the Netherlands especially as they form part of the Duchy of Burgundy. To the east you can see much larger nations, most notably the Islamic Ottoman Empire. Of course, the most important thing to remember is that the word Britain is anachronistic because Britain did not yet exist. Scotland was its own kingdom and, as shown in the map, the only area of Ireland controlled by the English crown was the Pale of Dublin on the east coast. Now let's study the Duchy of Burgundy in greater detail. The original borders of Burgundy now form part of Central Eastern France, but they also occupied lands in the north of Europe, what is modern-day Netherlands and Belgium, but was simply known as Flanders in the late 15th century. During the 1470s, the Duke of Burgundy, called Charles the Bold, attempted an expansionist policy to gain more land from France. While initially successful, he was killed in battle, and this resulted in his death in battle in 1476. As a result, the Duchy of Burgundy fell under the control of the French crown. Nevertheless, the Burgundian Netherlands remained a highly influential and semi-autonomous state, which was governed by Charles the Bold's widow, Margaret of Burgundy. Let's now look at France. You can see from the different colors that there remained several regions under semi-autonomous control. However, during the late medieval period, France was becoming increasingly centralized. As previously mentioned, the Duchy of Burgundy will be highly significant to our study of Henry's foreign policy. It is very common for students to mistake Burgundy with Brittany to the northwest, which at the start of Henry's reign remained an independent state. Finally, the most complicated nation of Europe was the Holy Roman Empire. This was a federation of different nations, however. Each of these had their own rulers and there were many different languages spoken across the empire. Many other nations were duchies, which were smaller than kingdoms, but there were also electorates. This means that technically they should have a leader that is elected into power democratically, though in reality the position was often inherited. The most significant position was that of the Holy Roman Emperor. Again, Technically this was an elected position, but by the end of the 15th century the Habsburg dynasty had become the de facto rulers of the empire. You will see that Belgium and the Netherlands also technically form part of the empire. The Habsburgs had a connection to Flanders since Philip of Burgundy was the son of Maximilian I of the Holy Roman Empire. By the turn of the 16th century, the Burgundian Netherlands, otherwise known as Flanders, was under Habsburg control, while the traditional Duchy of Burgundy became part of the French crown. One common misconception is that England was as powerful as its European counterparts during the 16th century. This is because we think of the British Empire and how they won the imperial race ahead of World War I. However, this would be looking too far ahead. England was not in a strong international position in 1485. This is mostly due to the fact that they had spent the past 50 years fighting a civil war, and had subsequently lost the ancestral territories of the Plantagenet kings in northern France. By the point Henry VII inherited the throne, the only foothold the English crown had in France was the northern port of Calais, which sat on the Channel Sea, with only 20 miles of water separating it from Dover. It was therefore vital for England's security that Henry kept control of the port of Calais. This diagram shows the relative level of power and wealth of each Central European nation. It includes all relevant nations to Henry VII's foreign policy, scaled to show their status in relation to England. In the late 15th century, England was not perceived as a Central European power. If anything, it was considered in the same category as the Scandinavian nations of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. The 50 years of civil war had also resulted in loss of territories in northern France. Therefore, they were not perceived as a significant threat to the other European powers. France was undoubtedly the most powerful and wealthiest country in Europe, and the foreign policy of the other nations often revolved around the French kings and their movements. Second to France was the Holy Roman Empire, which was a federation of semi-autonomous nations. Due to their location in Central Europe and the affluence of many member states, the Holy Roman Empire was an influential power. On a similar level of influence and power is the Italian states as a collective. These included the powerful duchies of Venice, Milan, and Florence to the north and the Kingdom of Naples to the south. Most significantly, though, was the Papal States, which was a band of land in central Italy that was owned by the Catholic Church with Vatican City in the center. There was then Spain to the southwest. They were a rising power, since they had recently unified the two separate kingdoms of Castile and Aragon and conquered Granada in southern Spain from the Moors. Their power would grow throughout Henry VII's reign due to the alliance they formed with Burgundy and the Holy Roman Empire. Burgundy, though small in landmass, was also an influential state due to their trading ports on the North Sea, especially Antwerp. Brittany was slightly lower than England in terms of influence and power. In 1485, Brittany was especially in a precarious position, and during Henry VII's reign would be annexed by their mighty neighbour of France. Scotland was also less wealthy or significant than England on the European stage. However, they did form what was known as the Old Alliance, which meant that whenever England went to war against France, they also faced invasion over their only land border from Scotland. Finally, there is Ireland. Henry VII was technically the overlord of Ireland, but the chieftains, or Irish magnates, largely governed independently. They were also a papal fiefdom, so owed homage to the Papal States. Though Ireland was not a significant European power, it was a useful pawn. Historically, Ireland has provided the backdoor to any invasion of England. This certainly poses a threat for Henry due to the Earl of Kildare's support for both pretended threats of Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. Let's go back to the diagram as a whole. It's important to remember England's position compared to the wealth and power of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain. This helps to explain why Henry had a largely cautious foreign policy and why he sought strong dynastic alliances. Let's now examine the key players in Europe during Henry's reign. The most significant figure was Charles VIII of France, the most powerful king of Europe. He had ruled France since 1483 when he succeeded the throne aged only 13. Charles VIII was a young and enthusiastic king who had expansionist ambitions. Firstly, he wished to annex Brittany, and secondly, he wished to conquer lands in Italy. However, Charles VIII died in 1498 after hitting his head on a door frame. He died without an heir, so was succeeded by a second cousin, who became Louis XII. Henry had very little interaction with Louis XII. His focus by the final decade of his reign was on his establishment of an Anglo-Habsburg alliance. However, Louis would later marry Henry's daughter Mary in 1514, when she was 18 years old and he was 52. Though not nearly as powerful as other European leaders, the Scottish kings were significant to English politics, since they shared a land border. Scotland and England were long-standing enemies, and the old alliance between France and Scotland meant that whenever an English king travelled over to the continent to engage in warfare with France, they risked a land invasion from the Scots to the north. The Scottish monarchs are relatively easy to remember throughout the Tudors' course. They are either called James or Mary, Queen of Scots. Until 1488, it is James III who is on the throne. One of Henry's first foreign policy decisions in 1485 was to sign a truce with James III so to ensure that he would not face an invasion while still consolidating his position on the throne. In 1488, James III's son James IV succeeds the throne. He was the Scottish king who attempted an invasion of England in support of Perkin Warbeck in 1496 and who then married Henry's daughter Margaret Tudor in 1503. Frederick III was the Holy Roman Emperor and also the head of the House of Habsburg. He governed over the HRE until his death in 1493. His funeral was attended by Perkin Warbeck, who curried the favor of his successor Maximilian I. As the second Habsburg to become Holy Roman Emperor, Maximilian I was important because he was looking to establish a dynasty powerful enough to rival the Valois dynasty in France. His son, Philip, was the Duke of Burgundy, and it was Philip's marriage to the Spanish Princess Joanna of Castile that bolstered the power of the Habsburgs. Burgundy was England's most significant trading partner due to their links across the North Sea and the growth of the cloth trade. However, Burgundy had been a staunch ally to the Yorkists during the War of the Roses, due to Charles the Bold's marriage in 1468 to Margaret of York, the sister to Edward IV. By 1485, Margaret of York was the Dowager Duchess of Burgundy, and she wielded a lot of power and influence. She would blight Henry's attempts at a stable and easy foreign policy until her death in 1503. When Isabella, the Queen of Castile, married Ferdinand, the King of Aragon, in 1469, they unified Spain into one large nation. Isabella and Ferdinand ruled as joint monarchs and together conquered the region of Granada from the Moors in the 1480s. Then at the turn of the 16th century, the Spanish crown invested in the voyage of Christopher Columbus to the New World. This heralded a golden age for Spain. Their influence, power and wealth would only increase during the 16th century. Henry could therefore see the advantage of an alliance to this growing power, which is why he chose Catherine of Aragon, the second daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand, as the bride for his eldest son Arthur. Finally, let's look at an important marriage among the second generation of rulers. Philip of Burgundy was the son of Maximilian I, and Joanna of Castile was the eldest daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. Their marriage would have incredible significance, since it resulted in the birth of a son called Charles, who during the reign of Henry VIII would rise up to be the most powerful and feared monarch in Europe. For now, however, it is worth noting that Henry VII wished to form a strong alliance with this new Habsburg dynasty. It was especially important following the death of Isabella of Castile, since this resulted in a power struggle for the throne of Castile between Ferdinand, the father, and Joanna, the daughter. Henry was somewhat caught in the middle of this power struggle because Arthur had died in 1502 and his widow, Catherine of Aragon, remained at the English court. Let's now look at Henry's key aims. It is important to remember that Henry was not in any position, both financially and dynastically, to pursue an aggressive foreign policy. I would argue that every step Henry took in his foreign policy was engineered to ensure further domestic security for him and his legacy. As a result, I would argue that Henry's main aim was security. This not only meant the physical defense of the nation against any invading army. It also meant the use of marriage alliances and trade agreements to ensure that England was not isolated on the international stage. Secondly, Henry wished to bolster England's prestige, in other words, the level of respect and admiration the country received from other nations. By increasing England's reputation abroad, he was also able to bolster the prestige of the Tudor dynasty. This was important for ensuring good trade deals and marriage alliances, which would protect England's position for the future. Finally, trade remained an important foreign policy aim. Trade links had collapsed during the Wars of the Roses, and so Henry wished to re-establish them on terms that favored the English merchants. Not only this, but Henry also wished to find new trading routes and to diversify the market so that he was relying less on the cloth trade through the Burgundian port of Antwerp. However, as we will see in the lecture on trade, Henry would often sacrifice good trading relations if it meant he could ensure security from the threat of pretenders or Yorkists. This is why, ultimately, trade has to be considered a secondary priority to security during Henry's reign. Let's return to our overarching question of how important was late medieval England on the European stage. The first thing to remember is that many modern-day nations were not unified in the 16th century, so there were far more smaller states, many of which formed the Federation of the Holy Roman Empire. Secondly, it is worth remembering that England remained a second-rate power on the European stage, especially when compared to France and the rising power of Spain. It is also worth remembering the names of the important players, especially the French kings of Henry's reign and the family members of the rising Habsburg dynasty. Finally, it is worth remembering that Henry's main concern throughout his reign was domestic security. This helps to explain why Henry pursued a largely peaceful foreign policy. Thank you for listening. We will next examine the foreign policy events of Henry's reign and tie these back to his key aims in order to evaluate their success.